Red, White, and Radical, the podcast, is based on the book Red, White, and Radical, What Organizations Can Learn About Change from the Rise of American Conservatism. You can get it from the publisher Routledge and in Amazon and other online stores.
Welcome to Red, White, and Radical, a podcast that explores how American conservatism has changed the world. I'm Warwick Harnese, and this is episode 6, Trump. Every 10 years or so, New York City tells the world an idealized story about itself. The plot of the story goes something like this. The Big Apple embodies the founding fathers' vision of America, diverse and democratic. A grid system jungle of opportunity and individual self-expression. At the best of times, it's chaotic and brutally dog-eat-dog. And then a crisis hits that makes the chaos, crime and corruption seem small time. Yet in the midst of the crisis, the city does what it can't do under normal circumstances. It comes together in the spirit of liberty to vanquish the demon of the day. NYC came back from the brink of bankruptcy in the 1970s and beat down a terrifyingly high murder rate in the 1980s. It united under the banner of patriotism after the terrorist spectacle of 9/11 in 2001, and under the slogan, "We are the 99%, when Wall Street imploded in 2008, setting off a financial crisis that threatened to take the world economy with it. In 2020, it's the American epicenter of COVID-19. New York's cycles of chaos, creative destruction and rebirth give the city its character, and the city in turn produces some pretty wacky characters itself that could only have been born of the 5 boroughs. So it isn't by chance that New York City gave the world Donald Trump.
I have a special interest in New York. New York City is a hot city, it's a great city, it's the greatest city in the world.
Trump's a New Yorker through and through, and the city's culture and history have shaped his psyche and his presidential persona. New York City is where the idea of America found its form, and today it's still a microcosm of the entire nation. Progressive and conservative, elitist but egalitarian, individualistic and strangely collectivist too. But how exactly did a native of America's most cosmopolitan city become the chief executive flag bearer for a nationalistic and isolationist strain of 21st century populism? The short answer is TV. Roger Ailes, founder of Fox News, used to say that if you want a career in television, first run for president. So Trump did just that. His plan was that he would run and lose and come out of his campaign with a more powerful personal brand that he could parlay into a Trump TV network. Obviously that plan went awry. TV's a big part of the story, but it's not the entire story. We need to consider 3 other historically important aspects of American political culture: conspicuous machismo, race, and self-invention. Let's take conspicuous machismo first. Straight talking, no bullshit, big man with wide shoulders type stuff. The kind of guy you see all the time in the American conservative media. And to be fair, across mainstream media too. It's not very European, which partly explains why the French intellectual Jean Baudrillard concluded, "Only tribes, gangs, mafia families, secret societies, and perverse communities can survive in New York." This is a point of pride for New Yorkers, who revel in the idea that ambitious people have to get their hands dirty to succeed. It's why every Jay-Z album opens with a skit that casts him as Scarface, the movie drug lord played by Al Pacino. It's why mob funerals in New York are solemnly glitzy media events, where entire neighborhoods turn out on the streets to watch the hearse pass. It's why the taint of scandal dogs so many New York area politicians, like former Governor Eliot Spitzer, brought down by a prostitution scandal, former Congressman Anthony Weiner, brought down by an underage sex scandal, and former Goldman Sachs CEO and New Jersey Governor John Corzine, indicted numerous times for financial misdeeds. Donald Trump had this kind of persona dead in his sights when he ventured out of Queens to build grand hotels in Manhattan. Trump hit Manhattan at its nadir in the mid-1970s. The city was bankrupt, its streets filthy, its authorities hopelessly corrupt. The journalist Legs McNeil evocatively captured the atmosphere of the time.
It was the end of white flight in New York. You know, ever since World War II, people had been moving out of the cities to these new things called the suburbs. So people were really leaving New York, and it was kind of deserted. And you really got this feeling that, you know, the parents had left, and you could take over and do whatever you want.
Trump knew that to build hotels, he'd have to deal with the city's well-oiled political machine. A political machine is a form of local government where a well-connected figure, usually referred to as a boss, orchestrates who gets elected. They're able to persuade local communities to vote for their candidate because those communities rely on them for, say, jobs. Trump alluded to this in 2016 when, in choosing to run for prez as a Republican, he had to explain why 80% of his past political donations had been to Democrats in cities like New York, Chicago, and Atlantic City. I've got to do that. All these fucking Democrats run those cities. You've got to build hotels and grease them to do so. It's a rigged system. These guys have been shaking me down for years. There was a Paul in Queens, an old guy with a baseball bat. You gotta give him something or nothing gets built. But if you take cash in there and you leave him an envelope, it happens. That's just the way it is. Between his father, Fred Trump, and his nanny, the city of New York, the young Donald was brought up to believe that business was unavoidably shady. As it progressed, his company began to look more and more like an organized crime empire. Russian, Panamanian, and Azerbaijani businessmen with dubious interests of their own became his most important partners and clients. Running for president, he brought that shadiness into his politics. James Comey, the FBI director that Trump fired soon after taking office, colorfully described his first impressions of Team Trump in 2016. I thought of New York Mafia social clubs, an image from my days as a Manhattan federal prosecutor in the 1980s and 1990s. The Ravenite, the Palmer Boys, Cafe Giardino. Later, at a private dinner at the White House, Comey recalled, Trump said, "I need loyalty, I expect loyalty." To my mind, the demand was like Sammy the Bull's Cosa Nostra induction ceremony, with Trump in the role of the family boss, asking me if I have what it takes to be a made man. Trump wasn't Italian, but he was a dyed-in-the-wool New York gangster. In 2016, his political strategists Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon correctly predicted that Trump's unique take on conspicuous machismo would strike a chord with blue-collar Americans for whom family and honor codes were everything. A couple of fantastic books published right around the time that Trump was elected confirm this. One of those books is called Janesville, about the closing of a General Motors factory in Wisconsin and how it impacts the families of people that had worked at the factory. The other is Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir about growing up poor in rural Kentucky. These books introduce you to people whose families had, for generations, served in the military or been part of a labor union. People who loved violent outsiders, whose fictional heroes were characters like Tony Soprano, who had supported corrupt Democrat political machines because they brought working-class jobs to their communities. People whose Rust Belt cities or Bible Belt backwoods had now long been in decline. Once, flying over Atlantic City in his private plane with an entourage, Trump offered to give a foreign model a tour of his casinos. The model's date, a billionaire, balked at the idea of stopping off in a place overrun by white trash. The model asked,
"What is this white trash?"
And in a rare moment of self-deprecating self-awareness, Trump replied, "They're people just like me, only they're poor." And that brings us neatly to the issue of race. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to vote against their own self-interest? Like, if you're middle class, why would you vote for policies that so obviously benefit the wealthy? This was the great conundrum that got me interested in American conservatism in the first place, and I soon realized that the question was redundant. People vote for their culture, for people who they think are like them, with similar beliefs and values, because they want them to legislate to protect that culture. The question for a politician is, what exactly is the culture that I need to align myself with? This is particularly hard in a country as big and diverse as the USA. If Jean Baudrillard thought that New York City was dominated by tribes and gangs and perverse communities, well, imagine that in every county across America. But you don't need to imagine it, because political strategists and pollsters do this work day in, day out on behalf of candidates and media companies. What they're looking to understand are the emotive issues that motivate people to vote. Since the American Civil War, race has been one of those issues. And it's become increasingly more emotive an issue since the civil rights era of the 1960s. One of the first political strategists to understand this was a data nerd called Kevin Phillips. Working for Richard Nixon in 1968, he painstakingly pieced together maps of county by county US presidential election returns so he could track voting patterns. Once he had a kernel of an insight, he'd delve into local histories to supplement his understanding of these patterns. His conclusion was this: politically, the US has not been a very effective melting pot. In practically every state and region, ethnic and cultural animosities and divisions exceed all other factors in explaining party choice and identification. Phillips put all his insights into a best-selling book, The Emerging Republican Majority. The title wasn't yet a reality, but neither was it hyperbole. It was a prediction of sorts, presented as a challenge to the Republican establishment. Here are the insights that you need to make the Republicans a truly national party. Yes, that's right. Even as recently as the late 1960s, very few Americans identified as loyal Republicans, because the Republicans were the party of the elite. Their only regional stronghold was in the Northeast. Up until the middle of the 20th century, that had been just fine. It was the most populated and powerful part of the country. But by the late 60s, the fastest growing part of the country was what Kevin Phillips called the Sun Belt, the southernmost parts of America that stretch from Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas in the east to Southern California in the west. 100 years previously, with just a few exceptions, these had been the slave-owning states of the Confederacy. So Phillips predicted that the culture of the Sun Belt would reflect the culture of the Confederate South. This was a culture that prized family and honor codes, those same values that Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway thought Trump could appeal to. And as the South had lost the Civil War, resentment of the government remained strong. The problem for Republicans was that the Democrats were the party of the South. The Ku Klux Klan was founded with the goal of preventing Republicans ever gaining a foothold in the South. Yet by the late 1960s, Kevin Phillips' insights dared Republicans to dream. Could we actually become the party of the South? Or even the common man? As it happened, their hand was forced. They had to try something new, and that was because they had to contend with George Wallace.
Everybody seems to be here. Everybody white. The city auditorium is packed with sweating, jostling bodies. Two little blonde-haired boys try hard not to get stepped on as their mama, holding tight to their hands, steers them through the cheering crowd. A band is playing Dixie as the people clap their hands in time. And someone is waving a Confederate battle flag back and forth, back and forth. The governor talks about a lot of things, but mostly he seems to be telling us that we are better than the Negroes. We had not known that we were better than anybody.
George Wallace was a Southern Democrat who holds the record as the longest-serving governor of Alabama. He rose to infamy in 1963 when, for the benefit of the national news media, he stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama in an attempt to deny enrollment to 2 black students that the federal government had decreed must be admitted. Wallace didn't mince his words.
They've called us rednecks. There's sure a lot of rednecks in this country. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
The bizarre thing was Wallace had previously had a reputation as a progressive when it came to race. It was like he'd made a decision to play the part of a race-baiting populist to get elected. Black Alabamans like the lawyer J.L. Chestnut and Zakozy Williams agreed.
People ask me a lot of times, was Wallace a racist? Now, was he a Ku Kluxer? No. Did he get up every morning and say, let me go find some black folks so I can lynch them? No, he wasn't that. And he would not have favored those who felt, and there were those who felt that way. But he could be perfectly reasonable in a conversation with a black person. And he could leave in the next 10 minutes, deliver the most racist appeal that you've ever heard in pursuit of votes.
In that time, those days, people didn't want Negroes to be upgraded. And that's why he hollered. That's why he said, nigger, 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 because he knew, the white people was against Negroes, and he wanted to be against Negroes so he could be elected.
During the 60s and 70s, Wallace took his show on the road, running for president 4 times. On the stump, Wallace, who aspired to be as graceful as JFK, was more like Hitler. The writer Hunter S. Thompson described the Wallace experience. It was the first time I'd seen Wallace in person. There were no seats in the hall, everyone was standing. The air was electric, even before he started talking, and by the time he was 5 or 6 minutes into his spiel, I had a sense that the bastard had somehow levitated himself and was hovering over us. He jerked this crowd around like he had them all on wires. They were laughing, shouting, whacking each other on the back. It was a flat-out fire and brimstone performance. The idea that Southern culture would influence the Sun Belt was a conservative prediction. It turned out that the entire country was being Southernized. As journalist Bob Ingram describes, George Wallace saw this before anyone.
People began to say, hey, this issue of racism and the concern about the blacks is not just limited to south of the Mason-Dixon line. It's up here too. But he was the first to sense that. He knew there was a racial problem, not just in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Georgia, if you please, but all over the country. And he took advantage of it.
It wasn't pretty, but race was clearly an issue that could help you win elections. Future presidents like Nixon and Reagan held their noses and popularized the racial dog whistle, coded language that would appeal to the Wallace vote. As the academic Dan T. Carter argues,
you can't explain Wallace's appeal to these people simply on the basis of their racism. Wallace, as a lifelong outsider, taps into working class and ethnic Americans, into their feelings of resentment, of anger, of frustration, of being on the outside.
And it's a cocktail of those feelings that Donald Trump is once again appealing to. Trump promises to build barriers, from crackdowns on illegal immigration and the construction of a border wall with Mexico, to higher import trade tariffs, the repatriation of tax dollars earned by American companies overseas, and the idea of bringing jobs back home that had been exported to cheaper labour markets. With these barrier promises, Trump is dangling a mirage of taking the national economy and culture back to a time when being born a regular white American meant a significant advantage in the world.
You recently said, and I quote, hedge fund people make a lot of money and they pay very little tax. I want to lower taxes for the middle class. How else do you plan to help the economy?
Look, I'm really rich. I know how to run a business, and I know this. Our country's going to be well off with me. So here's what I'll do. First, we have to cut government spending. It's out of control, totally out of control. Then we've got to lower corporate taxes. It's become impossible to do business in this country. We've got companies shipping thousands of jobs overseas. That's got to end. And it's going to end. Remember that. It's going to end.
I'm sorry. I wasn't paying attention. I was too busy staring at my beautiful reflection. I'm like a Greek god that just took a bath in a pumpkin spice latte.
That's a skit from The Tonight Show, where the host Jimmy Fallon interviewed Donald Trump. It was in the very early days of his campaign to be the Republican nominee for president, when Trump was generally considered a joke candidate. The conceit was that Trump was interviewing himself in a dressing room mirror. Fallon played Trump asking questions, and Trump played himself answering the questions. After Trump became president, Jimmy Fallon was accused of humanizing a monster, making him endearing to the viewing public. But Fallon simply gave him a platform to play a role he'd spent the previous 2 decades perfecting. This was Trump's second act. And for all his bullying and bad behavior, I think it's a positive trait that endeared him most to the electorate, his capacity for self-invention. All public figures to some degree have to be good at this. Presidents in the television age have proved to be particularly good at it. Nixon, Carter, Clinton, Obama, and the true master, Ronald Reagan. But Trump might be the greatest of them all.
Hello, Mr. Trump. It's an honor to meet you. I was wondering what you would say to President Obama.
You're fired.
Trump's entertainer credentials were honed out of necessity. Between the mid-80s and mid-90s, his company lost over $1 billion. If he once was a billionaire, he was now humiliatingly forced to simply act out the role on TV, in ads for fast food chains like Pizza Hut and McDonald's.
I don't know how you do it. I put together some really impressive deals. But this thing you've pulled off, it's amazing. A big and tasty for just $1? How do you do it? What's your secret?
Got a buck? You're in luck, because you can get a delicious beefy big and tasty or a McChicken sandwich for just $1 every day at McDonald's.
Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Donald Trump. We're all cut from the same cloth, and that cloth is very, very large.
It's not too big, is it?
No.
Why do New Yorkers have such big mouths?
Go big or go home.
Because they eat big pizza like the big New Yorker from Pizza Hut.
They've got to be losing money on this.
Pizza Hut!
Eventually, this led to his permanent role on The Apprentice, which put him in front of a national audience every week on primetime TV. But it was perhaps his cameo at WrestleMania in 2007 on live pay-per-view when he found the format that worked best for him. It was billed the Battle of the Billionaires, in which Trump and World Wrestling Entertainment chairman Vince McMahon each chose wrestlers to fight on their behalf. The loser would have to shave their head in front of a baying crowd of wrestling nuts.
Well, you won't be laughing after WrestleMania. You're going to be laughing at Donald Trump. See, Donald wrote a book sometime, a very successful #1 bestseller entitled The Art of the Deal. Well, this is one deal that Donald Trump is going to be really sorry he's going to sign.
What's going on over here?
Donald Trump is in a world he is not familiar with. This is not real estate.
Hey, look at this! Donald Trump! Donald Trump!
Donald Trump taking down Vince McMahon!
Oh, my God!
The hostile takeover of Donald Trump on Vince McMahon has happened at WrestleMania 23.
Oh, no!
Oh, my God. Trump and Lashley shaving Mr. McMahon bald.
Donald Trump actually doing the honors himself. One billionaire shaving another billionaire's head.
Here was an arena in which Trump could really perform, hamming up his conspicuous machismo, playing the big swinging dick billionaire dealmaker. And the people in the crowd were the people who would make up his future political base, the loud and proud deplorables, as Hillary Clinton famously dismissed them.
Donald Trump, as you said, just shoved Mr. McMahon on his billionaire butt.
The WrestleMania cameo was a prototype for the format that Trump would perfect on the campaign trail. Big, hysterical rallies like the ones that George Wallace had held 50 years previously. It's telling that since becoming president, Trump has increased the number of rallies he holds. He's never stopped running for president because campaigning is synonymous with entertaining. In this, the New Yorker Donald Trump has finally found his true home. On the campaign trail, somewhere between the Sun Belt, Rust Belt, and Bible Belt.